If you find this story interesting, you'll want to stick around until the very end for a special appendix chapter dedicated to some incredibly obscure lore reveals, including what is my personal favorite bit of Drow lore, along with some meta-commentary on a few open questions in the lore of Menzoberranzan that have never been answered until today. If you enjoy deeply obscure lore, you won't want to miss this. But right now, please allow me to share the origin story of the most popular and infamous city of the Drow people, but bathed in a shade of light like never before. This is the tale of the mother of Menzoberranzan. It was in the fading sparks of what most modern-day scholars agree was one of the earliest of Drow realms of the Underdark, where over 5 millennia ago, a brutal conflict would change the trajectory of Dark Elf history. Deep below the surface of Toril in the southern Underdark region that would later be known as Great Beharrenden, stood a divided city of the Drow. This region, still echoing with the ghosts of Talantawar, the first great dominion carved out by conquering Drow generations earlier, was home to Galathair. And our story begins, as all things Drow begin, with treachery consecrated as faith, dogma, and divine favor. Galathair was a city that bled ruin. A shard of that first Drow realm, Galathair was a successor city that rose from the ashes of Talantawar, inheriting its ambition but learning nothing from its past. Here, amidst the remnants of past glories, yet another internal conflict would ignite. The city's air, once the breath of dark stone and the Underdark's deep earth, now burned of scorched silk and forgotten oaths. A city engulfed in the malefic mist of opposing evils, their divine wrath manifesting in mortal cruelty, a callous disregard for the lives of the Drow bloodline. Here, under the amused eyes and ruthless judgment of two unseen gods, the Drow performed their terrible sacraments, the extinction of their own kind. Family against family, a sister's spell searing a brother's flesh, a matriarch's merciless command sending daughters to butcher kin, friend or enemy to live or die, all determined by who prayed to the wrong abyssal power. This gross theological schism had devolved into a brutal purge of worshippers on both sides, a certain ruination for all, with no mortal winners to be crowned. In a clash of steel and divine mandates, the Lolthite acolytes of the Spider Queen, whose dogma was an unholy scripture of hatred and oppression, warred with the faithful of Ganador, the Elder Eye and greater god of abominations and outcasts, whose own doctrine was an equally vile gospel of entropy and rot. The instruments of this divine cleansing were tragically mundane: blade, spell, poison, each wielded with sinister intimacy and brute force. A war between an already shunned race of people, this historic tragedy witnessed the city eating itself from within, as Drow turned upon Drow in a blood-soaked civil war, a conflict that answered every sacrament with equal measure slaughter. Surviving historical accounts, invariably tainted by the bias of a victor's ink, offer conflicting narratives of who drew first blood, a fitting ambiguity for a race that delights in its own rewriting of history. Regardless of who was to blame, the collapse of Galathair would be neither clean nor quick, but the price would be the soul of the city itself, a mortal wound from 1,000 deep cuts, spilling its lifeblood onto the darkened ground of the Underdark. The fall of Galathair showcased the tragedy of a civilization blinded by the allure of divine favor, perfecting the art of martyrdom and self-sacrifice while meticulously documenting the process for historical study. From a high temple balcony overlooking a plaza now slick with the viscera of Drow religious war, a young but powerful and respected high priestess of Lolth watched. Her face, framed by the stark silver-white hair and obsidian skin common to her kind, presented as an impassive mask at first blush. Only her eyes, two searing pools of crimson light, betrayed her horror, reflecting not just the needlessly spilled blood and raging fires below, but the shattering of everything she knew. She witnessed noble houses turn their ancestral blades upon each other, the fabric of Drow society unraveling thread by bloody thread. She saw faces familiar from temple rites, now frozen in the grotesque finality of death, their house banners trampled into the accumulating filth and detritus alongside their slain bearers. Then her gaze was caught upon the fallen standard of House Tusheth, a noble family whose matron mother had offered her ritual courtesies barely a 10-day prior. That prideful banner now lay torn and red-stained next to a daughter of the family as she was callously eviscerated by zealots of the Lord of Slime. Her spider emblem, a tribute to their goddess Lolth, defiled and mocked before it, along with the Drow air, was set alight with sickly green flame. For a young priestess who had never known her parentage, who had never known a mother's touch or a sibling's rivalry, she wasn't just watching the collapse of society, it was the evaporation of any concept of belonging, an acceptance among an inherently indurate people that she had spent her whole life trying to attain within the Church of Lolth's cold embrace. Not immune to bias, the priestess herself fought to control the seething hate born from the doctrines of her Lolthite faith toward the interloper god Ganador and his unclean gospels of dissolution. Yet she knew the only victor this day would be the well-fed crows. This purge, consuming worshippers on both sides with indiscriminate fervor, promised only ruin. Where once stood courts of opulent splendor, now smoldered only the waning light of eldritch flames. The black spires of Golothair, riddled with the madness of apostate sorceries and guttural ululations of worship, became little more than monuments to sorrow. A deep sense of futility settled upon the priestess, cold and heavy as quarried stone. Golothair was dying of its own hand, poisoned by the very divine mandates that claimed to offer salvation. This could not be the destiny Lolth envisioned for her chosen people. This self-immolation served no purpose but oblivion. Kneeling on the cold stone of her temple, hidden from the carnage yet escapably tied to it, the high priestess lowered her head, her thoughts turned inward, projecting her will across the lower planes, reaching into the dark abyssal nexus of the demon-web pits where her demanding deity resided. She offered no supplicating words in her prayers, but rather a focused, silent scream of Drow consciousness, presenting the spectacle of Golothair's demise as evidence of their plight. The High Priestess pleaded for the Spider Queen's guidance, for a sign, for a path away from this internecine madness that Ganador's creeping influence had brought, and which Lolth's rigid doctrines, reliant upon force and fear, seemed inadequate to quell alone. In her demonic prayers, she envisioned a new future for the Lolth faithful, a sanctuary consecrated solely to the Spider Queen, where her ruthless hierarchy of power could flourish, undivided and untainted by the noxious corruption and foul magics of the interloper god of slime. Let this slaughter end, she implored Lolth, not through the weakness of compromise, but through transcendence. Show them the way out. Hours turned to days. Time lost its meaning against the backdrop of incessant violence. She waited, prayed, and watched as Golothair continued its death rattle. Then, descending into her mind like a spider lowering itself upon an invisible silken strand, the vision came. Not a booming voice or a clear decree, but as unmistakable, insistent whispers woven into her thoughts, each accompanied by intrusive, surreal phantasms projected onto her inner sight. A colossal vault situated far to the north, menacing pathways designed to test the faithful and cull the unworthy. A promised land awaiting discovery, a canvas upon which Lolth's people could finally be painted anew. The Spider Queen's mandate was clear: abandon this dying city, gather the loyal, and lead them northward into the unknown depths of the Underdark, into a region that would later come to be known as the Northdark. The Lolthite priestess was certain the Spider Queen would guide them, test them, but ultimately grant them dominion if they proved worthy. Galvanized by divine imperative, the priestess rose from her devotions with an unnerving certainty and descended into the chaos as a herald of Exodus. Her presence, already commanding the respect due her status as a chosen of Lolth, now carried the added weight of prophecy. Following the Spider Queen's will, the High Priestess sought out the matriarchs of 7 key noble families, matron mothers of houses known for their wealth, power, magical aptitude, and, most crucially, their devotion to the Spider Queen. The Drow houses of Nasadra, Thayala, Sizril, Baenre, Tusheth, Yusrala, and, most interesting, House Masquelier, the 7th house, which we must circle back to at the end of our story. Seeking audience with these renowned Drow families, the priestess conveyed Lolth's divine message, painting a stark contrast between the certain ruin of Golothair and a beacon of hope offered by their exodus. Skepticism initially greeted her pronouncements, questioning the wisdom of conceding generations of accrued status and wealth and the relinquishing of ancestral holdings, all for a dangerous journey predicated solely on the visions of a single priestess, no matter how well respected she was. Yet the High Priestess persisted, her voice calm yet filled with a disquieting certainty, cut through the miasma of suspicion and painted the stark dichotomy of undeniable slaughter and the extinction of their noble lineages versus a new beginning offered by their deity. Her arguments deftly wove together pragmatic arguments of survival, of maintaining their bloodlines, appeals to show their unwavering faith, along with subtle reminders of the consequences that await those who defy Lolth's explicit will. Legends offer that as the High Priestess spoke, her eyes burned with a divine light, holding the gaze of even the most intimidating matrons, suggesting far more than charisma was at play. Whether it was her passion and conviction, the undeniable evidence of Golothair's ultimate fate, or perhaps the subtle persuasion of the Spider Queen's will and influence upon the matriarchs, is a matter of scholarly debate. Regardless, doubt soon turned to acceptance, and each were gradually swayed to see the logic, however grim. Better a dangerous gamble for a future under Lolth than certain annihilation in a war benefiting only demise. Each gathered their expansive households, a significant contingent of 7 powerful families estimated to total in the thousands, inner circle and heirs, seasoned military veterans and their armies, accomplished mages and their apprentices, close advisors, retainers such as craftsmen and artisans, lesser kin, overseers, and naturally the requisite throngs of servants and breeding stock slaves deemed essential for establishing a new dynasty. Turning their backs on the dying throes of a city they once called home, each noble family placed their collective faith in the hands and divinely inspired vision of a single, kinless High Priestess, who herself bore no house or lineage of her own. An entire, not insignificant segment of this ancient Drow civilization pivoting away from senseless, self-inflicted ruin to embark upon the most dangerous and epic of expeditions into an uncharted north. What they could not know then was they were marching willingly toward a series of new, divinely evil trials from their goddess of chaos that would take their own significant toll. It was, in its way, so terribly Drow. If you find yourself enlightened or entertained thus far in our origin tale, then don't let this channel suffer the same fate as Golothair. Show your support for the lore by liking, subscribing, and enabling notifications. And if you enjoy the art of these videos or plotting your own adventures and campaigns, my Patreon holds a treasure hoard of world-building resources to rival any noble house, and you can join for free with no obligation. The link is lurking below. No Drow betrayals, you have my word. Thank you. Now let us resume our expedition into the uncharted lands of the Northdark. As it turned out, swapping civil war for a forced march through the many hazards of the Underdark wouldn't feel like much of an upgrade of circumstance as it might have seemed amid the burning banners and blood-curdling screams of Golothair. The truth is, these self-exiled drow were exchanging one set of lethalities for another. Then again, such is the way of the Lolthite faithful, and the drow were most accustomed to the Spider Queen's proclivity for testing devotion through struggle and hardship. First, there was the matter of sustenance, or rather lack thereof. Provisions dwindled with alarming predictability. Foraging involved sampling local fungi which, with tedious frequency, turned out to either be instantly fatal, hallucinogenic in ways that made navigating narrow ledges problematic, or were simply revolting. Alternative options became rare when constrained by the fact that they ate the glowing fungus or they did not eat. So deciding whether to risk poisoning or face starvation became a routine bureaucratic exercise for the house overseers, usually resolved by feeding questionable specimens to slaves first. Then there was the local fauna. Giant insects, prehistoric reptiles, and carnivorous predators also hungry, and each taking offense by the added competition in their habitat. In time, even ambushes became a less terrifying surprise and more of an expected and regularly scheduled delay. And the established residents of the northern Underdark weren't thrilled with their trespass either. Stumbling onto someone else's mining claim, fishing village, or mushroom farm inevitably led to diplomatic exchanges, usually conducted with the sharp end of steel. Dark dwarves, or Duergar as they are called today, proved stubbornly resistant to drow reason. Perhaps it was their very recent liberation from the servitude of mind flayers that made them so grumpy, or maybe they just disliked drow on principle. Regardless, these encounters always ended in conflict, and each skirmish cost the drow lives, equipment, and critically, resolve, witnessed in the continued fraying of an already thin veneer of cooperation among the noble houses. When you're cold, hungry, perpetually lost in dark, uncharted lands, and liable to be eaten or stabbed by something or someone at any moment, faith in visionary leadership tends to erode. Morale, predictably, had plummeted. It started as incoherent murmurs, then rumor, eventually escalating to pointed questions directed at the priestess, whose unyielding certainty began to look suspiciously like pathological optimism, or possibly just the ignorance of youth. Yet when looking through the eyes of the faithful, the presence of Lolth was there. You just had to know how to read the signs. Just as the expedition was set to dissolve into the all-too-common of drow solutions, those involving violence, circumstances would shift suddenly. When the hopeful settlers seemed hopelessly lost, a large spider would appear right on cue, leading them to a before-unseen route forward to place the expedition back on their unknown northern course. Just as the pioneers hit the brink of starvation, a colony of easily slain giant cave bats would be found just around the corner, granting a gluttony of sustenance. And when the weary travelers encountered a large illithid patrol, sure to threaten an end of their pilgrimage prematurely, a well-timed tremor from unseen hands would fracture the earth, swallowing whole only those mind flayers in one fell strike. Only a fool or the unfaithful would attribute this to simple chance or good fortune. Luck in the Underdark? For the devoted drow, that was far more unbelievable than the idea of divine intervention. To the faithful, each of these opportunistic mercies carried all the hallmarks of the Spider Queen, executed with the blunt efficiency Lolth favored when reminding supplicants of her power. These events, interpreted as divine, effectively shut down any murmurs of dissent. However, the feeling it engendered wasn't piety so much as the evil goddess ensuring her chosen tools weren't uselessly broken before completing their intended purpose. After all, the scriptures were clear. Lolth tested the limits of her chosen relentlessly, only intervening or sending guidance when it served her divinely selfish interests. You weren't saved because you prayed nicely. You were saved because you'd endured enough suffering to remain potentially useful in her chaotic designs. Therefore, the survival of these drow pioneers was not a proof of worthiness, but instead a simple validation that they had not yet failed enough to warrant Lolth's disposal. The High Priestess-led Drow pushed ever northward through the uncharted and indifferent realms of the Underdark. However, the expedition would soon ground to an inconvenient halt where the rock itself bled veins of rusted wealth, easily identified as Iron Country. Rich veins of iron ore, a valuable find theoretically. Unfortunately for the Drow, this also meant nearby dwarves, now an obstruction to their advance north. Just another tedious variable in the hostile equation of the Underdark, where finding somewhere unoccupied is usually half the battle. These deep dwarves were masters of mining and the most stubborn defenders of their territories. The Drow overconfidence was as predictable as their approach, assumed superiority and planned for a swift and efficient victory. After all, they had superior magic, an enormous numbers advantage, and let's not forget, generations of ingrained arrogance on their side. Unfortunately, Clan Blackaxe hadn't received any memo about being easily subjugated. They seemed rather attached to their mine, possibly because it was, well, their mine and their home. Pragmatic folk, those dwarves. Underestimation in the Underdark proved to be a preamble to the expedition's most perilous challenge thus far. These hardy dwarves, rooted in their warren of stone and ore, were not intimidated and would prove a worthy enemy. Armed with heavy armor and equally heavy axes, the sturdy folk of Clan Blackaxe had the advantage of fighting on the familiarity of their own turf. And most importantly, as the Drow would soon find out, these dwarves had a remarkable capacity for enduring punishment. What followed wasn't so much a glorious dark elven battle as a prolonged, bloody brawl across a series of cramped, poorly lit tunnels. The dwarves, using their intimate knowledge of the terrain, met the Drow assaults with the bone-crushing impact of heavy metal. Their runesmiths invoked protective wards, and their warriors fought with the ferocity of a people defending their very homes. The High Priestess marshaled the Drow forces, unleashing waves of magic to heal and harm, conjuring spiders to overwhelm the enemy, and channeling bolts of unholy energies. Drow mages hurled destructive spells, filling the tunnels with fire and corrosive acids. And elite Dark Elf warriors moved among the shadows, their poisoned blades, arrows, and bolts seeking gaps in the heavy dwarven armor. However, these tactics of finesse and ranged attacks proved less effective than anticipated against determined shield walls blocking narrow passages. The Drow sorceries flared, sometimes to devastating effect, sometimes merely scorching rock or detonating harmlessly against crudely effective runic wards, while conjured spiders tend to get squashed rather messily under heavy iron boots. The dwarves, conversely, favored large, heavy axes swung with brute enthusiasm in spaces where dodging wasn't really an option. To say the fight wasn't clean or efficient would be a gross understatement. The dwarves certainly lacked the overt arcane prowess of the Drow, but compensated with brute force, superior defensive tactics, and a legendary courage that the Drow would not soon forget. Each dwarf, down to the last soul fully aware of their fate, sold its life to exact a terrible price for every foot of ground yielded. It was savage, claustrophobic, and while the victory was never really in question, the dwarven tenacity and resolve resulted in an embarrassingly high rate of Drow casualties. The last defender standing was their leader, a powerful dwarf with a commanding presence. His name was Dorn Blackaxe. A battle-hardened figure of courage and will, his bruised and bloodied form stood proudly to meet his death, braced against a wall of his own dead brothers-in-arms. As a flurry of Drow blades finally brought his end, he smiled grimly with a fixed gaze upon the High Priestess. With his dying breath, the dwarven chieftain uttered a curse that would be captured for the histories by a Drow scribe, wishing upon them the doom of many eyes. Victory, if one dared even call it that, had come at a dire cost. As the grim quiet of lives lost settled on this unlikely battlefield of crimson-painted mine shafts, the somber tally of Drow losses would exceed half their number, a catastrophic expenditure for a patch of rock they didn't even want. As they stripped the dead of valuables and weapons, they would forever remember these foes with a measure of cold respect, later memorialized in Drow chronicles as the Bravebeards who fought in the Battle of the Cloven Head Caverns. However, there would be no escaping the inevitable fact that the heavy losses suffered here would only heighten tensions and doubts amongst the now diminished surviving families. Months of travel were now counted in years as time bled into the oppressive subterranean lands of the Northdark. The Drow who made it this far were no longer the refugees who had fled Golathair. They were the hardened veterans, survivors, tested by the harsh realities of the Underdark and the truculent brutality of their chosen faith. Yet, despite the hardships and staggering losses from an exodus that was fast becoming a journey of legend in real time, suddenly the tunnel path forward ended. Not into yet another dead end, but this time opening into an expansive void. The expedition emerged, blinking into a silence broken only by the distant rush of water. Before them stretched a cavern so immense, the vaulted ceiling above soared into absolute blackness. Even the stone under their feet felt different, strangely smooth, unnaturally even, as if carved from the planet's bones, shaped in the precise, unmistakable geometry of a colossal arrowhead, its point facing east. The scale was mesmerizing, eerily illuminated by undulating fields of bioluminescent fungi pulsing with a prismatic glow. At the cavern's eastern tip lay a great dark eye of water, a freshwater lake, its surface ruffled by unseen currents indicating its value as a priceless resource. Around its shores, the fungal forests intensified, interspersed with groves of truly giant mushrooms, promising potential sustenance, exotic poisons, even building materials. And defensive stone ridges of the colossal cavern naturally rose like ancient protectors. Water, food, strategic positioning, even the air thrummed with Fersrez, that strange but potent radiation unique to the Underdark, pulsing with an intensity not encountered before. This ambient magic had even in these early times become recognized as the lifeblood of Drow sorcery, capable of fueling their most potent spells. Yet at these higher concentrations, the Fersrez would also offer new properties, such as creating a formidable natural ward, a quality that would, in time, become one of Menzoberranzan's greatest defenses, rendering the City of Spiders notoriously difficult, if not impossible, for enemies of the Drow people and their spies to penetrate via scrying or teleportation magic. The miles-wide cavern was absolute perfection, the kind of perfection that should make one immediately suspicious. A notable wave of stunned silence and awe rippled through the Drow ranks as the whisper started. Lolth made this. It was the only explanation for the flawless fit this divine geography offered. Forgetting themselves momentarily, the 7 matriarchs of the noble houses seemed to turn as one, looking to the High Priestess. She stood, her eyes drinking in the impossible vista as a knowing smile touched her lips. Closing her eyes, she nodded slowly as a single word provided affirmation. Yes, this was the perfect geography of her visions. This was Arilkarak. Naturally, such prime subterranean real estate wasn't going to be on the market long, or, as it turned out, even vacant. Moments later, a distortion in the fungal light to the south revealed the cavern's current, presumably long-term tenant. A great beholder emerged from a lair carved into the cavern's southern wall. The bloated sphere of ancient flesh hung suspended by unseen magics in the cavern's gloom like a malevolent moon. Its surface, a twitching knot of no less than 20 eye stalks, each glittering with an alien intellect and most of which now rested their malignant gaze upon the Drow invaders. This nightmare aberration would be seared into Drow memory as Yuthla, the many eyes of Arilkarak, and it was not alone. Orbiting its corpulent form like dead moons circling a diseased planet were a cadre of death tyrants, the reanimated, multi-eyed husks of former rival beholders now bound to Yuthla's will, necrotic energy leaking from their vacant sockets. The irony and manifestation of Dorn Blackaxe's final curse proved all too accurate, as the hovering beholder and its undead minions set upon the hopeful Drow settlers with menace and a singularity of purpose. In response to this ghastly scene, the disciplined ranks of the normally arrogant Drow warriors momentarily faltered. Their obsidian armor, usually a symbol of dread, now gleamed under a sudden technicolor onslaught. Beams as colorful as they were deadly lanced from Yuthla's myriad eyes, a terrifying kaleidoscope painting destruction across the dark elf lines. Viridian rays of disintegration struck warriors head-on, unraveling them into clouds of component dust that drifted momentarily before settling like foul snow. Other Drow caught in the path of ashen beams felt a horrifying stiffness creep through their limbs. Flesh rippled, hardening instantly into inanimate gray stone. Their final realizations caught, forever petrified on their contorted faces, forming screaming, lithic additions to the cavernous landscape. A sickly violet light washed over a flanking squad as fear took hold. Hardened veterans, moments before ready to die for their house and the spider goddess, shrieked, eyes wide in irrational terror, dropping their poison blades to scramble like cowardly goblins. Close by, an amber ray pulsed as soldiers struck by its paralyzing energy froze mid-stride, muscles locked, eyes wide with impotent horror as ochre beams washed over their comrades, slowing their advance upon the beholder and making them easy targets for the orbiting death tyrants. Yet perhaps the most horrific were the black, crackling beams of necromantic death that withered flesh from bone in an instant, leaving desiccated dark elven husks to collapse among their kin, their souls visibly ripped, shrieking from their bodies. Despite the carnage, however, the Dark Elves once again held a tremendous numbers advantage. Drow magic flared in desperate response, darkness like poured ink, illusions flickered and died in the beholder's anti-magic gaze, and blasts of raw force streaked toward the beholder. Through the carnage and pandemonium, the High Elf Priestess advanced, a black cipher against the pulsing lights, her focus absolute. She had led her people too far, for too long, at too great a cost, for this to end in defeat. Calling upon the Spider Queen of the demon-web pits, she met Yuthla's gaze, Lolth's will against aberrant far-realm cosmic horror. New dark powers, cold and hungry, surged from within Lolth's chosen, tendrils of abyssal shadow clashing against the beholder's myriad arsenal of rays. A desperate duel erupted amidst the wider slaughter. And then, summoning her connection to the Spider Queen, she channeled a final unholy surge of dark power drawn from the deepest wells of Lolth's favor, as a concentrated blast of pure, divine malice, raw chaos given form, struck Yuthla's dominant central eye. A sound like the tearing of ancient organic parchment echoed through the cavern. The great beholder shuddered violently, spasming as a visible ripple coursed through its grotesque form. Its levitation failed, and then it fell, hitting the cavern floor like a meteor landing in thick, wet mud. Instantly, the death tyrants, suddenly unplugged from their master's borrowed power, faltered as well. Their malevolent energy now dimmed. They lost cohesion, drifting aimlessly, lost for a fatal moment. Seizing opportunity, the Drow forces, rage now replacing fear, surged forward to methodically, ruthlessly exterminate each weakened, undead horror of beholder kind. Ara Rilkarak was theirs. The silence that follows the carnage of battle is always unsettling, this day broken only by the heavy, ragged breaths of the conquering Drow. The legendary accounts differ on what occurred next, muddled by the mortal bias of authors and the passing of time. Some tell of the appearance of Yuthla demons, the handmaidens of Lolth, each coalescing in front of the victorious Drow pioneers like greasy demonic candles made from a vile and rancid wax. Others, usually authors and narrators who lean into the more pro-Drow of histories, insist it was the Queen of Spiders herself, or that of her avatar, presenting directly to the expedition's survivors, her gaze falling upon the weary form of the High Priestess, addressing her directly by name. Menzoberranzan the Kinless, or as written legends sometimes insist, Menzoberranzan. Regardless, the Spider Queen decreed that this new homeland of the Lolthite people would be named after the conquering High Priestess. The chaotic divine presence of the Spider Queen conferring upon the High Priestess the designation that would cling to her name throughout history. Menzoberranzan the Kinless, founder of the greatest Drow city ever built, Menzoberranzan. With Arilkarak secured and sanctified by the Spider Queen's divine proclamation, the survivors of the Drow exodus from the ruins of Golothair set about establishing their new dominion. But the spoils of this Northdark victory and conquest came at great cost of life. The first action of High Priestess Menzoberranzan was to task the remaining slaves and laborers of each noble house to begin the grim effort of gathering the slain. In a practice that would become most tied to Menzoberranzan in later years and an outlier to the typical Drow practices of burial and the dead, she ordered the construction of early crude crypts in which to store the fallen. The lore hints that this gruesome practice has strong overtones that align with the dark art of necromancy, perhaps even by Menzoberranzan herself. Nonetheless, this practice is one that is followed even in modern-day Menzoberranzan. The founding Drow houses would first occupy the lair of the slain beholder, serving as a temporary shelter, while Drow retainer masons, laborers, and slaves began the arduous work of raising their new city from this cavernous floor of the Underdark, an effort greatly aided by the discovery of Yuthla's vast treasure hoard. While not explicitly called out in the lore, one could easily speculate that this initial head start of wealth not only accelerated the building of the city's foundations, but when coupled with Menzoberranzan's proximity to the surface of Toril, just over 2 miles above, this financial windfall likely promoted the city's fortunes as a robust trading hub in the years to come. Through the many tests of the Underdark and their faith, along with the loss of more than half their initial numbers, each of the 7 Drow houses that had once fled the destruction of Golothair now began the long ascendancy to take their place among the great societies of the Drow people. House Nasadra, a cruel lineage driven by an intense ambition, even by the already elevated Drow standards, and led by a matriarch hungry for ultimate authority, whatever the cost. Theala, a powerful family boasting a great many masters of the arcane weave, yet with pride as brittle as spun glass. Esriel, speculated to be among the hardest hit by the journey north, House Esriel lost the vast majority of their noble heirs and would find themselves in a precarious position of political vulnerability in the years to come. House Masquelier, a family built upon lies and the suspect allegiance to the Spider Queen that would find a fitting fate that I will touch upon in our lore appendix chapter. Some scholars posit that the houses of Yusrala and Tusheth may have begun this exodus as the 2 weakest of the 7 powerful Drow houses, a political ranking that would not improve in Menzoberranzan, each a diminishing house now clinging to nobility's shadow. And last, but most certainly not least, the house most will recognize in the modern lore, and for good reason. A powerful family of quiet calculators with great political acumen, House Baenre excelled at hoarding influence, under the conflicted bloodline and lineage that places the eternal Evaniel Baenre as the only matriarch to ever head the family, likely true, but serving as much as a title as family name. Still, true then as is today, Baenre was the most deadly of the Drow founding houses, although many did not know it at the time. As the city's walls rose and districts and plots were established, each would claim their territories, foundations laid for their future noble estates and sprawling manors. and for a time, a sense of unity within the Drow people of Menzoberranzan held. Through shared hardship, the trauma of such an enduring journey, or perhaps the sheer exhaustion of constant conflict, whatever the catalyst, a fragile truce was forged. They had each bled together, counted heavy losses and sacrifices together, survived together, and ultimately conquered this land together. A harmony born of necessity settled over the nascent city for almost 5 decades. But the Drow condition, the relentless ambition and distrust only fueled by Lolth's chaotic scripture, cannot long abide any equilibrium. With external threats vanquished, old grievances set aside but never forgotten or forgiven created the first cracks in the false facade that was Drow serenity. Ambition, pride, paranoia, and the insatiable hunger for power, temporarily suppressed by the demands of survival against a common enemy, now surged back with venomous intensity. The dogma of Lolth, which demanded constant struggle, the culling of the weak, and advancement through betrayal, turned inward with appalling efficiency. This most enduring of Drow patterns was first reasserted when House Nasadra, comprised of the most priestesses among the 7 houses, took every opportunity to subject the wizards of House Theala to ridicule and manufactured slights. What started with poisoned words and minor skirmishes escalated rapidly, fueled by paranoia and the pursuit of Lolth's favor, threatening to tear the fledgling city apart, a dark and ironic mirror to the theological bloodshed they only fled 5 decades earlier and learning nothing from its lessons. What we know from the surviving lore is that this house war continued to escalate for years until it reached its boiling point when House Theala, whose arcane masters already bristled at clerical command, discovered one of their own had been murdered in cold blood by way of torture at the hands of House Nasadra. With each house now being drawn or forced to choose one side or another, a full-scale war of the 7 houses brought the most infamous of battles, fought on the edges of the city's expanding boundaries. The written histories of war and conflict are penned by the victorious, and thus many details, many truths, become deliberately opaque, or worse, erased. So we must use a healthy dose of skepticism and interpretation on the events to follow, specifically on a single, most critical point. Was it an accident, the collateral and residual damage of battle? Did a stray destructive spell go awry? Or was it a calculated act of sabotage, a cruelly engineered deception designed to eliminate so many rivals in one fell swoop? Whatever the truth, the result was a measure of cruel fate saved only for the most vile and villainous. During the Battle of the 7 Houses, a massive section of cavern wall seemingly gave way at the most calculated of times, crashing down in a thundering avalanche of rock and stone. When the dust, dark as a funeral shroud, finally settled, 4 of the 7 founding houses now ceased to exist. House Theala, Masquelier, Tusheth, and Yusrala. Their matriarchs, daughters, heirs, and anyone left to carry a legacy forward, erased beneath a mountain of stone. And most tragic, crushed beneath these ruins, caught in the very heart of the destruction she ostensibly sought to mediate, lay Menzoberranzan the Kinless, the city's namesake and architect of their salvation. Her divine visions of prophecy ending abruptly in indiscriminate rubble claimed by the very rock she had conquered. This already conflicted lore only gets more cloudy from here. What is uncontested is that House Nasadra departed Menzoberranzan to eventually found another city in the Spider Queen's name. It was called Ched Nasad. Some texts state that Lolth passed swift judgment, exiling House Nasadra from the city. Most accounts tell us that the exile was more of an agreement at the encouragement of House Baenre, who had ambitious plans of their own. With 4 of the 7 houses annihilated and 1 exiled, the city's power vacuum was immense but short-lived. House Baenre, ever adept at navigating ruin with cunning and ruthless opportunism, ascended unchallenged to become the first house of Menzoberranzan, a position the house has maintained with iron-fisted tenacity to this very day. And so the story of Menzoberranzan continues to unfold, disturbingly consistent across the centuries as noble houses constantly scheme and maneuver for dominance. The city's history is an endless litany of assassinations, house wars, carefully orchestrated betrayals, and slave revolts brutally suppressed. It is a cycle endlessly repeating, driven by the cold arithmetic of power and the terrifying whims of their goddess, all ensuring the city remains a perfect, self-renewing engine of chaos. The obscured and at times conflicting lore surrounding this foundational origin tale often leaves specific details open to speculation and, of course, educated guesswork. And I'm certain there are more than a few savvy lore scholars among you who are right now asking the same few burning questions I had, based on the narrative story just shared. While definitive answers are scarce, buried under millennia of Drow bias, revisionism, and the passage of time, if we dig deep enough into the obscure, we can find enough lore to make some reasoned and plausible deductions. I have a few specific questions that have never been answered canonically that I want to share, but before I do, I am obligated to start this lore appendix by noting that there exists at least one version of the lore that offers a slight variation on the battle with Yuthla the Beholder to claim the land that would become Menzoberranzan. That lore tells us the Drow expedition, already weary and diminished, had actually first attempted to flee Ar-Arilkarak and the fabled encounter with the Great Beholder. In this version, Lolth would manifest before them, taking the form of a beautiful, gigantic female Drow head upon her terrifying arachnid body. In what this narrator can only see as a divine rewriting of history, the Spider Queen would proceed to halt the fleeing Drow, imploring that they were her chosen people, and confirm Menzoberranzan's vision that this was indeed where a new Drow city would be raised in her name. The demonic goddess would then rally her Drow by ensuring each that if they were worthy, they would claim this cavern as their home. Now, I find this telling of the events both less plausible and really diminishing of Menzoberranzan's role and the Drow people as a whole in the lore. Sure, let's flee our home, travel from one end of the known Underdark to the other in a pilgrimage that was counted in years and a dramatic loss of life through countless battles. And then, once we reach the envisioned destiny of our people, a new homeland, let's suddenly become cowards in need of a deus ex machina from a demonic goddess in order to save the day. Yeah, that's a no-fly zone for me, but it's one version of the lore, so do with it what you will. Let's move on to some questions mostly unanswered in the lore, until now. The first question I had back when I read this origin story well over a decade ago was the scale of the journey. Where exactly was Golothair, and how far did the priestess Menzoberranzan lead the Lolthite Drow people? The canonical lore holds tight her secrets, only placing Golothair vaguely within the vast southern Underdark region known as Great Beharrendan, but gives no precise coordinates or neighboring cities. Heck, even a strong landmark would have helped. Was it near the Great Rift or the Dark Gulf some 400 miles further southwest? No help from the lore there, but we do know that Golothair existed somewhere under the Shar, so by placing it between the known southern Drow cities of Talindhet and Elerth Dryer, we can trace a path north and west to the future site of Menzoberranzan using a canonical map and key. And when we do so, we find the distance is absolutely staggering. Even optimistically, assuming a relatively direct, almost as the crow flies route, a certain impossibility in the twisting three-dimensional terrain of the Underdark, the journey would cover approximately 2,500 miles. To put that in perspective for surface dwellers, that's slightly longer than traveling overland from New York City to Los Angeles, California, and on much better footing. I point this out to highlight what a monumental journey this exodus was, almost assuredly traveled on foot due to the elevated and difficult terrain of the Underdark. The second, somewhat related unanswered question that has always bothered me is far more difficult to answer, and that is the size of the initial expedition, a number never explicitly stated anywhere in the lore. all we're given is the knowledge that 7 noble Drow houses were involved in the Exodus. But I really wanted to find a plausible number. So in my research, I used some later lore detailing the typical structure of Drow noble houses. This would include, of course, all family members, matriarchs, daughters, sons, and their trusted mages, warriors and clerics, plus house retainers such as artisans, teachers, and other non-combat Drow such as craftsmen and masons. This number would also include consorts, servants, and, yes, a significant number of laboring slaves. I mean, someone has to do the actual real work. We can estimate each of these early noble houses comprised somewhere between 270 and 430 individuals, broken down as I'm showing now. Of course, these totals would vary by house size and status. For example, the ruling House Baenre of modern Menzoberranzan would exceed these numbers threefold, but for those ancient times, I'm pretty comfortable with these numbers. Multiplying by 7 gives us a rough starting figure of perhaps 1,900 to 3,000 souls embarking on this perilous journey into the Northdark, a journey of over 2,500 miles. And let's use the higher estimate of 3,000 for simple calculation, acknowledging this is of course speculative. But now comes the real question. How many of those 3,000 actually survived this harrowing migration? Again, the lore is of very little help here, giving us no real numbers. So I turned to a real-world historical model, looking for long, arduous treks through hostile territory, and the best example I found was the first of the Holy Crusades, where I was surprised to find that attrition rates from non-combat causes, that would be starvation, disease, minor skirmishes, or misadventure such as falling into a bottomless underdark chasm, easily reached a minimum of 30%, with some models eclipsing 50%. Applying a napkin math-friendly 33% attrition rate to our starting 3,000 leaves us roughly 2,000 souls. Now the lore does give us one solid metric when detailing the battle against the dwarves of Clan Blackaxe in the Cavern of Cloven Heads, telling us the victory cost the Drow, quote, more than half their number, end quote. Let's be generous and just call it a 50% loss, further reducing the pioneering Drow survivors that started at 3,000 now down to approximately 1,000. Finally, the text only mentions that many Drow perished in their final battle with the beholder Yuthla the Many Eyes. Even assigning a very conservative and speculative 10% loss for this battle leaves us with an estimated 900 survivors, less than a third of those who originally fled Golothair to actually begin building Menzoberranzan. A grim reminder, the price of Lolth's favor. Now let's turn to one of the more obvious conflicts in the lore that needs some quick clarity. The vast majority of the contradictions and conflicts seen in the history and lore of the Forgotten Realms are born from retcons across new editions, often to support the desired changes of new authors and their vision, or to better align some anachronistic lore with current views. However, what I find most interesting about this contradiction is it exists not only in the same edition of the lore, but also the same book and even on the same page. And while in my opinion this is just an example of mistakes made by mortal authors, no big deal, it is still very interesting, so I thought it'd be fun to share. If we open the text of Book 1 of the Menzoberranzan boxed set for 2E and look on page 24, we are first told in the lore's recounting of the battle with the great beholder Many Eyes that, quote, more than one house perished utterly in that fray, end quote. More than one, clearly implying at least 2 houses were wiped out in the battle. Yet only a paragraph later, as the lore closes out the same battle with Yuthla, it is confirmed that Menzoberra the Kinless proclaimed the cavern their new home in the name of Lolth, and, quote, left to stand with her at the end of that day of death were the families Ezreal, Theala, Baenre, Masquelier, Nasadra, Tusheth, and Yusrala, end quote. If 7 houses fled Golothair and the 7 houses stood in victory over the great beholder to found the city of spiders, then more than one house could not have perished in that battle. Again, I think I can confidently say the first quoted lore is nothing more than a mistake, as there exists much lore across several sources that confirms not only that 7 houses founded Menzoberranzan, but that it was those specific 7 houses that each began their exodus in Golothair, part of the canonical and accepted lore. Do you find these types of mistakes or anachronisms as fascinating, or am I just a pedantic lore scholar? Feel free to let me know in the comments. But before we close out this story lore volume of discovery, I do have one final fascinating footnote, perhaps my favorite piece of the city's lore, and it concerns the resting place, or rather lost resting place, of the mother of Menzoberranzan, Menzoberra the Kinless. Those familiar with the City of Spiders are quite likely familiar with the great stone pillar known as Narbondel. This massive stalactite has served in the lore as the timekeeping monument of sorts for Menzoberranzan. But some of you may not know it holds a much deeper secret, and according to the lore, one apparently lost even to the most ancient of dark elf houses. Within that colossal hanging stone, those earliest Drow settlers are said to have constructed the tomb intended for Menzoberra the Kinless. The 2e lore suggests that a hidden door exists at the very apex of Narbondel, leading to a descending staircase that spirals down into the lithic pillar's core. There, in a hidden chamber, the priestess's body was once interred, encased within a silken cocoon, and suspended upon a vast, magically preserved spider's web that spanned a seemingly bottomless abyss below. And the best part of this lore is that, canonically, not a single Drow was aware of this. That is, until this sacred tomb was violated many centuries later by Zagnafian Duerden, the famed father of Drizzt, the most famous or infamous Drow depending upon your perspective. Entering the tomb to retrieve the dagger bearing Menzoberra's name, the Drow Weapon Master's act disturbed the ancient magic that sustained the web, causing it to shatter. The cocoon, bearing Menzoberra's remains, lost forever in the abyss. The tomb, built to honor the city's founder, known by almost no one, now lies empty, its very existence forgotten by the Drow, who mark their very days and nights by the magical light reflecting its exterior. And let me close with a little adventure and world-building tip. Canonically, the lore tells us that Menzoberra's tomb was disrupted and fell into the abyss below... That's it. From this very open-ended fate, I love the concept of Menzoberra, a favorite of Lolth's high priestesses, who, let's just admit, got the lore-equivalent ending of a Star Trek red shirt, now being revived as a champion of Lolth, tasked to emerge upon the mortal world once again in service of some grand scheme of pure evil in the name of the Spider Queen. Yeah, that is definitely going to happen at my table at some point in the future, and maybe a PDF adventure on my Patreon. Let me know what you think. Menzoberranzan still holds a great many stories of treachery to share, from the fall of House Obladra during the Time of Troubles, the Battle of Keeper's Dale, the Silence of Lolth, the Demon Hordes of 1485, and of course, the fall of House Duerden, and the many tales of its rebellious son Drizzt. Menzoberranzan is perhaps the best proof that in Drow culture, even after a genocidal exodus across 2,500 miles of uncharted Underdark, you can take the Drow out of betrayal, but you can never take the betrayal out of the Drow. So let's defy that Drow stereotype, shall we? Show some non-treacherous appreciation for my work by liking, subscribing, and ringing the notification bell. And if you'd like to enjoy the spoils of conquest without actually having to appease fickle spider goddesses, consider claiming your territory over on my Patreon. It's like finding the Beholder's treasure hoard, but far more ethically sourced. Thank you to my channel and Patreon members that make these lore discoveries possible. And thank you for joining me on today's journey as we learn that Drow are always gonna Drow. A truly heartwarming tale, don't you agree? Until next time, take care, my friends.